So thank you very much for being here. I will quickly introduce myself. My name is Eric Maurice, Editor-in-Chief of EU Observer, a news website based in Brussels. I'm very honored to participate in the Prague Summit and to moderate this opening session with our distinguished guests and panelists. I'm also very happy to be in Prague, a city with a rich history. We can see palaces, churches, works of art, but also a history of wars, revolutions, and a long road to democracy, especially in this country. It's a bit like the history of Europe. Now we have the European Union, which is the main topic of this conference. And the EU's history can be seen as a succession of treaties, of summits, and complicated decisions. It can be boring sometimes, but it is the sine qua non condition for the ultimate goal to succeed, the goal of peace and prosperity in Europe. The EU is a community of values, but also, and sometimes above all, a community of rules. When you want to join the EU, you have to accept the acquis communautaire. When you want to join the Eurozone, you have to accept the Growth and Stability Pact. When you are an EU member state, you have to implement directives and regulations. Regularly, rulings by the European Court of Justice shape EU law with consequences for European societies. And every month, the European Commission issues new infringement procedures to put member states back on the right track. But that is theory in the EU. In reality, member states often do what they want, and some more than others. More than a decade ago, France and Germany clearly said they would not respect the Growth and Stability Pact. France is still under an excessive deficit procedure and has managed to escape sanctions twice. Last year, the EU decided not to impose fines on Portugal and Spain, despite their not respecting the rules. And today, the Commission is expected to open a case against a few countries, including the Czech Republic, because they have not taken their share of asylum seekers in the relocation scheme. On one case, the Commission says the rules have to be implemented intelligently and with flexibility. In the other case, it said that all member states are required to apply the rules in the name of solidarity. At the same time, today's EU is built on exceptions. Not all countries are in the Eurozone or in the Schengen area. The idea of two-speed Europe was even pushed earlier this year by Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, and by the European Commission as a way to accelerate EU integration. But other countries, including the Czech Republic, feared that they would be left behind. These few examples raise the question of whether EU member states should be expected to follow the same rules. Some exceptions are considered as bad for the EU, while others are presented as a way to overcome difficulties. But what makes them bad or useful, and how can we decide if they are bad or useful? Asking these questions is also asking the question of what the 27 remaining member states want to achieve and how they want to do it. Do flexibility and exceptions lead to better political management of the EU, or do they make EU values and rules dependent on political bargaining? Can they be a way to take into account different situations and constraints among EU members, or do they encourage those who attempt to introduce exceptions to the rule of law in Europe? Is multi-speed Europe the best way to keep together countries with different situations, interests, and ambition? Or is it an admission that Europe cannot be a coherent bloc, opening the door to an unraveling of the project? I hope you will forgive me to randomly throwing these questions, but I am sure our panelists will be able to add some insight through their experience and knowledge of EU and of the relations between all the players. So we have in this panel Massimo D'Alema, a former Prime Minister of Italy and President of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Jakub, you are Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for European Issues here in Prague. Peter Balázs, you're a former Foreign Affairs Minister in Hungary, a former EU Commissioner, and a professor at the Central European University in Budapest. And Jakub Wisniewski, you're Vice President of Globsec and Director of the Globsec Policy Institute. We'll have questions in the audience, and also there is the application on which you can send questions, and they would be on the screen, and then our panelists will be able to answer. First, we could have a look at when countries do not respect the rules. And I will turn to Massimo D'Alema first. As Italian Prime Minister, have you been in a situation where you had to decide whether to respect the rules or whether not to respect them because politically it would have been easier or it would have been in a better interest for your country? Do you think that respecting the rules is something that has to be done whatever the situation for the country and for the EU?
First of all, my personal experience was as a prime minister. I was immediately after President Prodi, the prime minister who introduced euro in Italy, joining the criteria for euro, which was very tough for our country, but very successful. And not by chance, Prodi was appointed as a president of European Commission. After some years, I was foreign minister of Italy and deputy prime minister. I was twice in government, but we used to respect the European rules. I have to say that it was another era. But in general, I believe that in a union, one has to respect the treaties and rules that we have written together. I never had a liking for a theory over Europe à la carte. For Mrs. Thatcher rebates, for the opt-outs, and the final conclusion of opt-outs was the Brexit. And well, the problem I want to raise is different. And now we are living a very difficult crisis. On one side, the crisis of the previously uninterrupted process of growth, development, and improvement of quality of life of the Europeans. We have unemployment, in some country a very unsustainable unemployment rate, particularly for young people. We have poverty, impoverishment. We have inequalities. Inequalities between different countries, inequality within our own societies. And I wonder, the current European rules they do work in order to face this challenge.
For all countries?
I believe no. I believe I'm in favor not of violating the rules, but I'm in favor of a reformability of European rules. And second, and then I stop, we are living another crisis. the transformation of the international political scene. Never before in the post-war era were relations between the United States and European Union at such low ebb. President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement will negatively affect the future of our planet, but also the transatlantic relations. Mr. Trump last month's visit to Saudi Arabia, the relaunch of an aggressive strategy toward Iran, and the supply of a huge quantity of arms to the Gulf monarchies might rekindle hostilities between Sunni and Shia, therefore deepening the crisis in the Middle East, frustrating attempts to favor peace and cohabitation. This is against European interest. And on the other side, never forget, we have Putin, assertive nationalism, and Putin is fueling nationalism, populism, anti-European movements across the European Union. Never in the past, Europe was on one side, the United States, our traditional friend, on the other side, Russia, surrounded by the hostility of big powers. And Ms. Merkel's statement that Europe should take its fate in its own hands has been dramatic, proud, but dramatic.
And in a way, a call for a kind of discipline to go towards the same objective and pursuing the same interests.
And so, my second question, how we are up to the challenge? I doubt. I believe that we should put in common, but really in common, defense and foreign policies, migration policies. What we need is a leap forward in political integration of Europe. Are we ready for that? All European countries? That's the problem. You say, I believe we must respect rules and treaties. My question is, our rules, our treaties are up to the dramatic challenges we are facing at economic level and political level. That's the problem.
Thank you. In a way, you anticipate the question I have for your neighbor, Jakub Dur. You mentioned migration crisis. I mentioned in my introduction that today the Commission will, maybe it has announced it, but is going to open a case on the Czech Republic because of the relocation scheme, meaning Czech Republic is, according to the Commission, not respecting the rules. So I will ask you a first reaction on that, and how would you explain the policy, the position of the Czech Republic in that? Do you think that certain conditions in some countries, on some issues, at some time, can lead and can justify, can legitimate a request not to do what has been agreed or pushed forward by the EU?
Well, I don't believe that there is a justification of such a step, of such a decision, since the rules are there to be obeyed. But of course, the question is not as black and white, yes or no. It's more about what is the scale, and where are the limits of making a, let's say, political and at the same time administrative decision. I believe that that is precisely the problem, how you usually understand the European Commission as the honest broker, and that kind of role being played by the Commission is emphasized many, many times. At the same time, of course, European Commission is one of the institutions, is one of the clear political bodies of the whole structure of the Union. And for observers, especially for anybody coming out of the EU, for example, it's difficult to understand that in this regard, Commission is double-headed creature where the politics is, of course, linked to the administrative powers as well. I don't need to mention the rules which were not obeyed or which were obeyed by American companies, and how strong the position of one of the best commissioners we are having in this current setup, Madame Vestager, how strong her position is. To understand that she is not a political voice of the Commission and that her steps are not politically motivated, and that she is also responsible for a certain DG, Director General, which is responsible for the administrative parts. It is a difficult thing to explain to an observer, and it's definitely also difficult to explain to, let's say, the citizens in our countries. And that's why the question of politicization of the Commission is part of the Czech discussion here in Prague. It's part of our kind of critical reflection on the role of the Commission being an honest broker or playing a more political role than it was the case in the previous commissions, the previous colleges. You have variety of schizophrenias when it comes to various decisions where the honest broker was supposed to act. The Stability and Growth Pact criteria were mentioned, and the series of broken rules and number of years during which this was the case is a famous example, and you mentioned it. Austria, 2000, and the way how at that time, pre-Lisbon EU was looking at the of the broken rules when it comes to...
How would you explain these different of treatments depending on countries and topics?
Then we can move, of course, to rule of law issues and the limits and the scale again, where the action is needed, and where when basically there is this sensitivity that you can act and that you have to act. And then there is a kind of clear infringement case, as it is the case of every infringement college sessions. And here I would answer your question by stating, yes, this is probably what is going to be happening in a couple of minutes. And of course, if you break the rule, if you don't obey the rule, then you pay, or you basically follow what the penalty is about.
Peter Balázs, you've been on both sides, as I mentioned. As a commissioner first, when you were in Brussels, the guardian of the treaties, that must have been the main thing that you wanted to maintain or to achieve at that time. Would you agree that the Commission plays a kind of schizophrenic role, administrative and political? Do you think it's still maintaining a balance of what it should be? And Hungary also has been on one of the targets of some EU commissions or EU Parliament's actions and declaration. Would you have the same kind of reaction as Jakub Dürr about how countries should relate to the Commission, and should they keep some kind of political leverage in how to implement these rules?
Well, I think that the Commission is much more than the honest broker, because if we use that picture, then we suppose that others do the business and the broker is mediating between the parties. So member states are the masters of the EU. Everybody knows it and everybody respects it. But such a big organization consisting of today 28 member states needs an executive body. Like the United Nations, like the OECD needs a secretariat, like the WTO and many others. So the Commission also has a role to implement the will, the political will of the member states. Member states should give the guidance. This was the original idea of setting up the European Council, which used to be a fireplace talk show, and today it's an institution of the EU, very good so. And then member states should trust the Commission to do the business, the daily business. Now the problem is, and as you said, I was sitting on both sides, within the Commission and also in the Council, mostly in the Council of the Foreign Ministers. Now the frequency of Council work is too high. Foreign ministers are meeting every month. It's very good to see the colleagues, but we are repeating more or less the same things. And there are many other ministers who attend monthly meetings under the cover of the EU, not to speak about number one politicians, heads of government, practically every second month. So I think that it would be a much better distribution of roles to have less meetings of member state representatives and to have more trust in the execution. But then we come, and I can see some mistakes and failures on the Commission side as well. One which is going to be a textbook example, this refugee quota. Everybody shares solidarity with Germany and Sweden, which have been overloaded by refugees and very, very humanistic and open. But what the Commission did, this setting up an Excel table, distributing mechanically people between and among member states, preceded the political agreement. And this is my main criticism. And if you speak in that respect about that politicization, you are perfectly right. Because in such a very sensitive, new and important case, the right procedure should be that let's sit around the big table and let's put the question to the member state that, do you agree that we have to solve this problem together? And when everybody says yes, okay, do you agree that we cannot shift all the burden on one or two member states and then again look for nodding heads around the table? And when you will have got the political support, yes, we agree on that, we will share, then you put up the Excel table, then everybody is going to execute. Now what we have got is the non-compliance, the clear and tough political resistance of a few member states to share the burden, refusing solidarity. So this is an unfinished business, an unfinished political action.
Jakub Wisniewski, when we listen to the former Prime Minister, former Minister, Commissioner, would you say that these controversies about implementing the rules or deciding them is due to how the EU system is built, or is it mainly due to the different crises that the EU and member states have been through, and what kind of reform would be necessary? We've been speaking, at least since Brexit, of how to reshape the EU. Is it something that would be needed, and should it be a priority?
I'm gonna surprise you by saying that I don't think that the EU institutions are guilty here in this crisis. I think it's the national politics that is going rotten. And what we can see is the recriminations on many sides about things that have domestic audience as a center. It really makes me sad. I'm a Polish person living in Slovakia, and I haven't seen many refugees where I'm staying. And it's not because of the fact that governments are defending bravely the borders of these countries against some asylum seekers. So this is a favorite casus belli for many politicians, but also people who like to thrive on scandal. I don't think that this is the way forward for the EU to to go for more sanctions, punitive actions. The EU was invented a long time ago to make people's life better, to bring prosperity. And this happened partially, but this also now is stumbling because of the fact that people do not understand what's happening to their lives because of globalization, because of certain economic trends. But I would not focus on Visegrad 4, for example, countries that are here in Central Europe and are singled out for misbehavior. I'm not a fan of this attitude. This is your problem, this is Italian problem, this is Maltese problem. I believe that European solidarity, noblesse oblige, the Central European countries should show more effort in helping out, in making this problem disappear as a common challenge, common threat. But at the same time, this is a subject which is very delicate, very sensitive. Just let me draw your attention to the fact that over 90, maybe 95% of people living in Poland or Slovakia are homogeneous ethnic group of local origin. So there has not been much interaction with people coming from elsewhere. So Western European politicians should be aware of this specific aspect of these societies and maybe help to come up with some solutions that are not straightforward, top-down bureaucratic projects such as this of the European Commission. And maybe last word about the role of the European Commission. I believe that there should be a policeman in the single market. So I don't think this is controversial that the European Commission comes out strongly against member states, against companies to protect level playing field. I have more doubts as regards other sensitive subjects which are not easily definable. For example, rule of law, democratic standards, etc. Because this is where the devil lies in the details. And we have seen examples in the past like Austria, Slovakia in the 1990s, which did not necessarily fit to some of the democratic standards that Europe wants to be part of. But at the same time, sometimes it's better to come up with strategic patience instead of coming down hard on societies, because sometimes societies have to pay the price of the decisions of politicians of their own countries.
And what about the procedures on the rule of law? Because you said on migration we had to take into account the regional or national circumstances, but on the rule of law, is there something such as trying to understand the local context?
Well, I'm skeptical again. I am Polish, I come from Poland, which is now singled out as a case. And I know that Polish society is 80% in favor of European integration. And even the current government has no mandate for anti-European policies. So I would not like the baby to be put out with a bath, so to say. I would like to avoid the situation when the society goes anti-European because of decisions from Brussels. And I think that many people will agree with me here that this procedure is not properly tested. It's something new. It has not been used before. So it's a kind of experiment on the living body. And I would not like this experiment to go wrong, so to say, no matter how it is important to me for Europe to be and remain community of values.
Jakub, in the discussion there, we've seen in Brussels and in the European Council about what to do after Brexit during this Bratislava process. I think the Czech Republic was one of the countries asking for more powers for the member states, kind of rebalancing of powers. But would not that be an open door to a kind of arbitrary meaning each country would decide when it wants to take power, when it agrees on sharing the decision and the implementation? What was the philosophy behind that, keeping in mind this discussion about respecting rules or having exemptions?
I believe that it was more about bringing back legitimacy of the whole project and coming back to certain kind of roots and principles rather than advocating for a major change of the primary law. It was more a question, what can we do when reflecting post-Lisbonization of the whole structure? How do we feel about that? What is the interinstitutional balance and agreement on how we feel about that kind of balance, facing major kind of challenges when it comes to the direct democracy principles applied, and it was not only Brexit. Of course, there were previous cases years ago. Double referendum in Ireland, the failure of the first treaty in the Netherlands and in France. Those kind of basically major questions, I think all politicians in member states as well as in the Brussels bubbles should be asking. And the Czech answer probably at that time, facing the atmosphere of Brexit and the shock which it has caused before we reach the Bratislava roadmap and all those informal summits which are now again happening. I think that the answer was, okay, it should be the leaders of the member states who should do the reflection, set the tone in a way. And of course, it was not about kicking out from the room the European Commission or the European Parliament, but it was more about basically an attempt to bring EU closer to the citizens. But of course, there was not a final answer. You know that the discussion on the future of the EU, all those white books and reflection papers, it's still here with us. It's part of a longer story, and the legitimacy issue is probably still part of it. So here we go. It's just the beginning, and we know perfectly well that our positions, as for the national government positions, will be always keeping the primary law framework. We would never go the very adventurous and very risky road and bumpy road of changing the Lisbon Treaty and the primary law, and thus basically threatening the whole project as such, because we kind of understand that that would be a major problem when reaching an agreement on something new.
Peter Balázs, when you joined the Commission, it was just after the enlargement in 2004. There was a kind of optimism at the time. All these new members agreeing to the project and to the rules, and looking from that period to now, how do you explain and how do you feel? Do all countries share the same objective as they did at that time? And do you think that at 28, soon 27, we saw with the experience that it was impossible to try to have one block with one set of rules and decisions, and that it's a kind of historical consequence of having this kind of discussion today, of having enlarged the bloc very quickly and to many members. We hear that very often about the enlargement.
Okay, so when we recall that glorious day of the big enlargement, the 1st of May 2004, it was like a kind of a wedding. So a highly expected magic day when things change, and this was really the reunification of the two parts of Europe. So it was a glorious event. Then, using the same picture, we could see the difference between a pre-wedding and a post-wedding behavior of the parties. So it was very different. And let's speak about the candidates, the new member states. We promised everything in order to be accepted, in order to be a full equal member of that wonderful organization. And after the entry, some clever politicians, clever is in quotation marks, discovered the maneuvering margin within the EU. They said, okay, there is a way here, there is a other side way there. We are not absolutely obliged to comply with all the rules. We have a little maneuvering margin. And then what they discovered, in fact, that these are the mechanisms of the two-level governance. We are living in that two-level governance. Some decisions are taken in the capitals, some other decisions are taken in Brussels together with the others. And between the two, there are some white spots which are not covered by anybody. There are some missing spheres in the competencies and so on. So this is one thing. The other side, the second part of your question, I don't think that this is an automatic disobedience on behalf of some countries. We are quite simply too many. Too many. And 28 means that we cannot be the same. We have different burden-sharing capacities. We have different political backgrounds, sizes, locations, and many other things. So it's more than natural that in an organization which is far beyond the founding six was a wonderful family table. 28 is a big assembly coming together and accepting the differences. So for me, a good European governance should consist of two main elements: very clear rules and some flexibility in the implementation. But, and this is my closing word to that question, both should be pre-negotiated. Rules, we should take the time to negotiate the rules, but once we have got them, then to implement. And it is valid also for the flexibility, because flexibility is not equal to non-compliance. Flexibility is the application of pre-negotiated exceptions under well-known conditions.
Massimo D'Alema, I would like to come back to a point that you touched upon in when you first talked about the social policies and the economic policies. You mentioned unemployment, especially for the young people. We know we have all these discussions about the application of the Stability and Growth Pact, with the Commission saying now we need some flexibility. Do you think that's necessary? An example is Wolfgang Schäuble, who is all over Europe considered as a hardliner because he keeps on repeating you have to respect the rules. So is he completely wrong? Should he change that? Is the Commission right to be flexible and sometimes having two different set of measures according to the situation? Are social issues something that would legitimate also these exceptions?
No, flexibility is not an exception, because the flexibility is in the treaty. And I believe flexibility is an opportunity. But in my opinion, it's not enough. Because my personal opinion is that we should reform the Stability Pact. Because the European crisis is, first of all, lack of investment. The analysis that the core of European crisis is a national debt is, in my opinion, incorrect. The core of European crisis is lack of investment. Is that we are not investing enough on innovation, research, development, and we risk a downgrading of the European competitiveness and on the European economic strength. And that's why I personally believe that to consider the investment as a public spending is a mistake. No one company consider investments as expenses. It's a different thing. It's a mistake. And I believe we need to enhance the Eurozone governance. I'm in favor of Eurozone finance minister, of a stronger integration. And of course, I understand that it is possible only accepting the leadership of Germany. But Germany has to understand that leadership means generosity. The Americans became leaders thanks to the Marshall Plan, not to the austerity. not to the austerity. And the most disquieting, worrying problem is that we have a strong country which would be naturally the European leader, but they don't want to exert their leadership.
So they are the exception in a way. They are the exception.
That's a political problem. That's a political problem. And because leadership means to push Europe toward policies for growth, development, full employment, social justice. If we want to regain the consensus of the Europeans, otherwise, I think is understandable that when Europeans have the opportunity to vote, they vote against. It was in French referendum, in Netherlands referendum. They vote against because the perception is that the European rules, the European structure, the European technos power is working against the interest of European ordinary people who want a fair job for their children, want a better life, more social justice, more social protection, and when they listen to some European official to talk about structural reform, they're afraid because structural reforms means cutting pension, cutting health care services, and that's unacceptable. If we want, and I want to relaunch Europe, we need the comprehension that European citizens want what they want. Better life, more investments. I don't think that the national debt is the key of the future of Europe. The national debt of Japan is the double of the European debt. The national debt of the United States is much higher than our But the Americans, in order to support, to implement the economic recovery, they spent a flow of dollars, public money, not private investment, public money. And I'm talking about the United States of America, not Soviet Union.
Not a socialist country.
And we are prisoners of rules so strict. I can understand. Our rules were established in another era. Also, not only because it was a period of growth and development, but also culturally, because the European rules are under the influence of the German ordoliberalism, which was the ideology dominant in Europe. But now we need a new economic way of thinking. Keynes is coming back. If you read Stiglitz or Piketty or Mazzucato or Krugman, Keynes is coming back.
But you would have to convince a few other countries.
Yes, of course. But what is impressive is that in our university, there is already a new way of thinking. Politics is still resisting. We must change politics. And let me say one thing, because about European Commission, honest broker, the European Commission is a political body. Let's remember that the European Commission is not only based on national government designation, but is based on confidence votes of the European Parliament, which is elected by citizens. The European Commission has a double legitimacy. This is the new element of the Lisbon Treaty, and which means that the European Commission is a political body, and we need a political body leading Europe, not a technocratic body. And second, I fully respect the responsibility of national states, but and I know that migration policy is national responsibility. There is now an European migration policies. But we are not talking about migration policies. We are talking about an international emergency because of war and the flow of refugees. And we must treat this issue according to the international law. And the international law established that refugees
Have a right to.
who escape the war must be accepted. And we cannot tolerate European countries which don't respect the international law, because this is against our fundamental values. I want to be clear on that. The international law, not European treaty, but our fundamental values is to respect human rights. And according to Human Rights Declaration of the UN, The refugees who escape war must be accepted. I believe that is normal, is the only way to face this crisis is to share the burden. And we are not talking about to share the burden of 2 million refugees, because the relocation is about 150,000 people. Germany accepted 1 million people. Germany accepted, I'm critical sometimes about Germany, but when I have to say Germany accepted 1 million people. We are talking about the relocation of some thousand refugees. It's unacceptable to have a member of European Union who answer no. And I think that in that case, sanctions are needed. Because when one is part of a community, there are advantages, structural funds, open markets. We supported growth and development. The per capita GDP of citizens of Poland was the same of the citizen of Ukraine when Poland became member of the European Union. Now is four time. To be member of the European Union was a big advantage for Poland. And I'm very happy of that, because it's one of the missions of the European Union to provide better life, growth for European citizens. But at the same time, as a member of a community, you must take some responsibility. You must share some burden. This is, I think, the rule of any communities, of any community. It's not something strange or some imposition or some bureaucratic decision of the technocrats of Brussels, but I think it's normal being member of a community, having advantages for that, to share the burden when we must face together an international emergency which comes from wars and from tragedies, unpredictable. It's not the European Commission who decided to have a war in Syria. It's an emergency situation. And we, with solidarity, we must face together. That's normal, I think.
I see we don't have any questions on the application. Do we have a few questions in the audience? I don't know where's the microphone, if we need one. But, well, maybe if you want to start, please introduce yourself and tell us who you want to ask your question to. Oh, yes, we have a few questions.
Mr. Wisniewski, Yes, hello. Thank you for the interesting panel. I would like to ask that, yes, of course, European Union was created with peace in mind and so on, but once in history, Crimea happens. And sometimes there are political issues which actually noblesse oblige. How we should address this? Having in peace in mind, or with no sanctions, or hoping for the best? Or thank you.
I think that the European Union did already much by coming up with sanctions against Russia. Myself, I don't think it's enough. there should be more action on the European and international level in general. And when Prime Minister D'Alema was speaking about solidarity, I agreed with you, which means that I believe that Central Europe should do more about migration project. But I don't want Central Europe to be singled out as enfant terrible of Europe. After Georgian war happened in 2008, there were Western European leaders who had very cozy relations with President Putin, who did not necessarily stand up to the values that Europe represents. So again, this is a package. It's about mutual solidarity, and it's about many things, not just migration. So let us not use the old stereotypes against Central Europe, because many politicians will jump to conclusion we were too quick to let them in, because they are irresponsible. And it's not that easy. There are problems everywhere in Europe, and there are examples of lack of solidarity everywhere in Europe.
I see a question on the board. Why do some member states get away with infringing EU rules? Is it issue-based or power-based? Well, we more or less answered that question, but I wanted to ask you as a former commissioner, how the decisions are taken in the college, when you have the discussions between all the commissioners.
Well, I think the answer to this question is rather simple, because member states do not focus on EU rules, but have some back thoughts based in their member states, and give up some EU norms and solidarity in order to increase their popularity within the country, or just serve some home-based interest. The Commission decision-making is very consequent in infringement cases. We are really protecting EU law.
We can take two questions in a row and answer them, and then maybe we'll have to finish. So if you want there, and...
Roger Casali, the founder and CEO of NewEuropeans.net. Grazie Massimo D'Alema, who has reminded us of what our European identity is. We see that in our attitude towards migrants and refugees. And yes, we must welcome refugees into Europe, and we must give them the opportunity to stay. We must give them the chance to work, and we must give them residency, permanent residency. And when we have done that, we must offer them European citizenship too, a new kind of citizenship, which I hope can also be offered to the 1.4 million UK citizens who live in the European Union and are citizens of the European Union, and who will cease to be citizens of the European Union when Britain leaves. And we are in a situation, yes, the European Union is a community of rules, but we are in a situation now where we have no rules. And the European Union needs to look at these British citizens and see them as European citizens, and remember that we are building a Europe of the citizens, and give them their rights, their unilateral rights now. Be bold, be courageous, and say, take them out of the negotiations, tell them they're human beings and not bargaining chips, and give them their secure rights as permanent residents, even though they won't be passport holders of an EU member state. Give them a new kind of citizenship, the right to stay, not on a special basis for Britain, but because that's Europe's future. Europe has got to be a Europe of the citizens, and we need to give that security and those rights to British expats in the EU, and also to migrants and refugees, because that's who we are. The European Union is the greatest human rights organization in the world, and we need to show it in the way we behave towards refugees and to the British, who will be left outside European citizenship unless we act now when Britain leaves the EU. Thank you.
There was another hand raised here.
Ivo Kaplan, European Institute Renaissance. I have one question for all, how they think about the next migration from British Islands to France, as Mr. Macron invited educated people, researchers and the others. I'm also working in research in nuclear field. The second question is for Mr. Deer. If he listened to Mr. D'Alema, if he read the article number 42, you know that Czech government invited people from Europe to have a special meeting on the 9th of June to launch the European Defence Initiative. So how the Czech government, or he, because he is the expert of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, will change his mind and support these European ideas, or he is taking responsibility for that issue that Czech Republic will be in the second league, not more in extra league or the first league. What we did all the 90s for that the Czech Republic will be a very responsible member of EU and NATO, and now he's talking like he's talking. So there is my questions.
If you want to answer that.
Well, I'm talking like I'm talking because, of course, I said what I said. It's so clear. If there is a break of the rule, you get sanctions and you obey those rules. That is the hypothesis number one. Second issue, it's not about values, this discussion, and it's not about the content of the migration crisis, as we can have different, of course, solutions and approaches to it. It is about rules and not obeying the rules discussion, the community of exceptions, and for me, it is actually the discussion where and how, under what conditions, the sanctions, the infringement procedure, the infringement step is made. And here, of course, as I can clearly see, the situation is not black and white. There are 25 member states, if you go back to the migration issue and the relocations, not obeying the legislation which was passed. Now, my question is, whether all those 25 member states will be, of course, part of the infringement procedure which will be announced. That is the basic question which I think should be discussed properly. So, is it merit-based? Is it power-based? Is it issue-based decision? Otherwise, I believe in the principles, of course. As somebody coming from Brussels or spending more than 5 years there, I, of course, as many others, thousands of them, every month closely watch the infringement sessions of the college. There are specialists there in Brussels at every permanent rep, as well as in capitals, specialized law companies, lobbyists, everybody who closely follows actually those sessions. And of course, we believe that the procedures leading to the decisions during the infringement sessions of the college are made based on the highest consideration. But we also understand that there are methods how to postpone the decisions. There are ways how to have a certain impact on those decisions, and that is the Brussels bubble secret we all know. So it is not about me being unlucky to actually happen to be a representative of this government sitting here discussing migration issues today in the Lion's Den. This is just happening, but of course it is more about really the question which is the question of the panel. Is it rule of law which is applied? Is it something where the exceptions are tolerated and thus weakening the whole community, or is it about a rule which is constantly obeyed and thus preserving our community? I answered the question. Article 42 is Article 42.
Permanent structured cooperation. Yeah.
That's a discussion you can have during the break if you want. Do you have something about...
Can I tackle Brexit question?
Yeah, exactly. About the rights of citizens, especially after Brexit.
I am happily married, but it seems to me that divorce trials are not usually too nice experiences. And to me, a magical word here is reciprocity. I believe that there are people in this room, young people, who would like to go to the UK and study there. Well, in the case of hard Brexit, you're gonna be for a nasty surprise, because you're gonna pay the double price that the British pay. And if you want to be a barman somewhere in London for your vacation, forget it. Or you're going to have to get a working permit and many other procedures. So the point I'm making is that I represent European interests here, and I want the rights of migrant workers, ordinary citizens going to Britain to be kept, to be recognized. So I would not, Mr. Barnier, to go to Brussels or to London for negotiations and give something for free. It's about reciprocity. Maybe it's pragmatic, maybe it's a bit ruthless, but as a European, this is my case. And also, a Brexit, as sad occurrence as it is, I think it's a useful experience for all of us, because we need to understand that the EU is not prison. You can leave the EU if you want, and the life outside of EU might not necessarily be heaven. Let's see, let's wait and see.
Thank you. I think we've covered everything. It's quite stimulating start for the conference. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for our panelists, and now we can have the break. Thank you.